Hi, I'm Molly, and this is The Inquisitor's Tale. Chapter 16, The Companion's Tale. Jean, Jacob, William, and Gwynfort left the town of Saint Denis, following the famous prior Michelangelo di Bologna. "So," William said once they had left the town, "where are those books?" The wind was cool and fresh on their faces. Others traveled down the road, but none close enough to overhear them. At least, so they all thought. After these children became outlaws, I pieced together their conversation from snatches gathered by those who remembered seeing this strange band. "I do not know," Michelangelo replied, "but we do know that the Talmuds have been collected by the various abbeys and then sent to Paris. So our first stop is an abbey just to the west of Paris, in the wood of Vincennes. The abbot there is a friend of mine. I will ask him what he knows of this conflagration, where it is to be, and when. And, of course, also, if he knows where the books are. He may. He is, after all, a confidant of the king." "Why would the king know?" asked Jacob. "It is the king who is burning the books, is it not? Well, his mother, Blanche de Castile, is the prime mover, I am sure, but I gather that the king is collaborating enthusiastically." The blood drained from the faces of all three children. "The king," said Jean. "I thought we were going to steal some books from an abbey or something," said William. "You would rather steal from the church than from the king?" Michelangelo replied. William hesitated. Then he said emphatically, "Yes." He added, as if Michelangelo should know better, "Stealing from the king is treason." "Lower your voice," Michelangelo whispered. And then he added, "I told you it would be dangerous." And then, as if that had ended the conversation, he strode out ahead of the children. Gwynfort trotted along beside him. William, Jean, and Jacob looked at one another. William pointed at Jean. "You volunteered for this." Jean said almost to herself, "We're going to steal from the king?" "And die," Jacob added. "I'm pretty sure we're going to die, too." The wood of Vincennes is a deep wood, full of grand old trees and runs of sparkling water. The sunlight shone through the bare branches and the slanting golden rays as they approached the abbey. The monks there, Grand Montines as they are called, are silent. Always. Only the abbot may speak, and then only to distinguished guests. The abbey door was small and modest, just a rounded wooden affair set into porous, honeyed stone. A black bell hung beside the door, with a leather thong dangling from its center. Michelangelo whipped the leather thong against the metal, and the bell hummed quietly in reply. Michelangelo turned to the children and put a finger to his lips. The wooden door opened, and a thin man in a gray monk's habit appeared. When he saw Michelangelo, he bowed, and the great red monk inclined his head in response. Then the Grand Montine looked at the rest of them. His eyes went wider and wider as they passed from Jacob, who was dressed like a peasant, to William, who looked like no monk the Grand Montine had ever seen, to Jean, who was not just a peasant, but a girl, and finally to Gwynfort, who was, it will be remembered, a dog. But the small gray monk sighed and looked to heaven as if to say, "What else would I expect from Michelangelo di Bologna?" And he waved them inside. He led them up a stony path to an orchard. Pear trees stood in rows. A robin sang from a nearby branch into the disapproving silence of the abbey. Jean had the urge to shush it. That's how quiet the place was. While Michelangelo walked with the monk to the low-slung buildings of the abbey, the children were set to wander silently through the orchard. William put his arm around Jacob's shoulder. Jacob leaned his head against William's ribs. The big boy's warmth was calming. He sighed. Jeanne led Guinevere by the scruff of her neck to prevent her from chasing the robin. At the far end of the orchard, a group of monks were tending to one of the abbey's exterior walls. Sprawling vines of ivy had grown across it. Oops. There it is. The vines were beautiful, deep green against the glowing, sun-kissed stone, like the illuminated marginalia in a manuscript. But these marginalia contradicted the text, because the ivy was silently eating away at the mortar between the stones and would one day bring the walls down. So the monks were tearing the beautiful lines of ivy away. But were they monks? As the children came closer, they heard whispering, and, could it be, laughing? Jacob was prepared to turn away, but Jeanne was drawn to the group. The whispering and the chuckling grew louder. These young monks hadn't noticed the children and were laughing about whatever young men laugh about when they think they are alone. Suddenly, one of them shushed the others, and they became silent. They looked chastened. They went back to ripping the ivy from the walls. While the other monks tore ivy from stone, one busied himself collecting the fallen vines and heaping them in a pile. Like all the monks, his head was covered with the gray cowl of the order. He was doubled over and grunting when he noticed the children. He stood up, and as he did, his cowl fell back from his face. He was a handsome man, clean-shaven, with a square jaw, dark ringlets for hair, and smiling eyes. The children gasped, but not for his physical beauty, striking though it was. They gasped at the thin golden crown that settled in his black curls like eggs in a thrush's nest. William was the first on one knee. It was shocking, really, how quickly the big boy got there. His head was bowed, and with his hands he steadied himself against the cool, wet grass of the orchard. Jacob was just a moment behind him. He too fell to one knee and bowed his head. "God protect His Majesty," William said, entirely forgetting the vow of silence. Meeting a king tends to induce a temporary but powerful amnesia. Trust me, I know. William's voice made the other young monks spin around. It was clear, though, that they were not monks. Their gray robes hung like cloaks from their shoulders, and under the robes shone the richest, finest garments the children had ever seen. Not festive clothes, mind you. No furs or silks. Just the finest traveling clothes in the kingdom of France. Each of the king's men had the bearing of someone who expects to be respected and accepts that respect gracefully. But none was so regal, so striking, nor so handsome as the man who wore the crown. Which is why William was nearly frantic when he whispered, "Jeanne, bow!" But Jeanne did not appear to hear him, for she did not move at all. Terror roared like a tiger in William's chest. "She's having a fit," he thought, "in front of the king. How in God's name will we explain that to him? Will he have her killed, drawn and quartered, decapitated with her head on a stake?" All of these flashes of the future, miseries occurred to William in the time it took him to turn his head to see what Jeanne was doing. When he finally clapped his eyes on her, his heart sank even further. She was not having a fit. She was just not bowing to the king. The punishment for refusing to bow to the king was worse than the punishment for witchcraft. William didn't know what it was, but he was sure it was much worse, much worse. Jeanne took a step toward the king, and then another. Jacob turned to William and hissed, "What is she doing?" William shook his head in despair. Jacob whispered, "Should we tackle her before she reaches him?" William shrugged as if to say, "Maybe." By this point, Jeanne had crossed the distance between the boys and the king. She had turned just a few degrees as she approached the Lord of all France. And then, at last she knelt and bowed her head. But to the utter horror of William and Jacob, she was not bowing to the king. And then, as if the situation was not horrifying enough, Gwynfort trotted up and sat down beside Jeanne as if she too were refusing to pay obeisance to King Louis IX of France. Little Jeanne was bowing to one of the king's companions, a young man about the king's age, with a thin, pale face, a nose like an eagle's beak, lank, dark hair, and a weak chin. If anyone was more obviously not the king, he was not present in the group. Jeanne said, "Bless me, your majesty." The pale young man replied, "Bless you, my child." The king's men, including the one wearing the crown, that is, me, looked on with mild wonder. William and Jacob, on the other hand, stared with their mouths as wide open as cathedral doors on Easter Sunday. And that is how we met the children and their dog, the handsome man concludes. "Wait, you were wearing the crown?" Marie the Brewster says. "Yes, but you're not the king." "How astute of you. I am Jeanne de Joinville, one of the king's companions. When the king goes out, one of us often dons an imitation crown for the king's protection." Marie sweeps us all with her eyes and then says to the king's companion, "You ain't all that humble about your appearance, are you?" Jeanne de Joinville smiles. False humility is no humility at all. And you don't seem to think King Louis is all that good-looking either. King Louis is the most beautiful man I have ever seen, but his beauty radiates from his wisdom, his piety, and his kindness, not the dust and flesh that cling to his bones. Fair enough. I sit quietly, examining the courtier. "You are really Jeanne de Joinville, companion of the king, seneschal of Champagne?" The handsome man smiles. "I see my reputation precedes me." "And do you, I ask no more, of this tale? How did these children, who seem to have done no harm to anyone, become the most wanted people in all of France? Why has the king declared war on them?" He arches his black eyebrows and smiles. "That is an excellent question, my friend, and I am just the man to answer it." Oops. There he is. Chapter 17, the second part of the companion's tale. The refectory of a Grandmontine abbey is as spare as the monks' lives. In the Abbey of Vincennes, wooden tables and wooden benches stood in rows. No tapestries hung on the honeystone walls. The few windows were glassless, and the air blew in like the chilly breath of a silent and distant god. There was not even a dais for the abbot and his distinguished guests, as there would have been at a Benedictine abbey, for the Grandmontines don't hold with the pride of status. I think that's why the king visits them so often. The children sat opposite the king, staring at his milky face and weak chin and lank, wet-looking hair. In stark contrast to the darkness of his hair, his eyes are limpid and blue. "How did you know?" King Louis asked the little girl. "I should tell you that our king is both gentle and firm, self-possessed and sympathetic. These apparent contradictions express themselves in everything that he does, down to his elocution. It is exact and perfect in every way, and yet it is not ostentatious. Like his clothes, the richest in France, and yet simple, almost forgettable." "You say you have never seen me before, and yet you recognized me. How?" Jeanne opened her mouth and then shut it again. She was appraising the king. as if she had a secret and could not decide whether it was safe to share it or not. I lost patience. "My lord, isn't it obvious?" "Is it, Joinville?" "But of course, she's seen a drawing, your majesty, a picture, your royal seal emblazoned with your face." "Where on earth would she have seen my seal, Joinville? She's a peasant," the king retorted. He asked Jeanne, "Have you ever seen my seal?" She shook her head. "Have you seen a picture of me?" Again Jeanne shook her head. "A manuscript? An image of any kind?" Jeanne continued to shake her head. "Then you gave it away," I said. "Your kingly bearing, your imperious gaze, your royal regard." The king's long face grew longer. "Did I give it away, my child?" Jeanne shook her head. My impatience boiled over. "Well, does she speak? Will she shake her tongue and unlock the mystery of your identification?" The little peasant had trapped her lips between her teeth. I leaned across the table. "It is not wise to play games with a king." She seemed to consider that, her mousy hair all a tangle on her head, her small eyes focusing first on the king, then on the table, then on the king again. She was afraid. I could see that. Afraid of letting something go that she had long guarded. Finally, she opened her mouth to speak, and the heavy hand of Michelangelo de Bologna fell on her shoulder. "May I, Jeanne?" he said. The little girl's eyes traveled up to the great monk's red face. She closed her mouth and let him speak. "What I am about to tell you, your majesty, will surprise you." He looked at me and added, "Your highly skeptical friend may not believe me at all. That, notwithstanding, it is true." The king moved forward on the plain wooden bench. I shifted uncomfortably. "These children are each capable of extraordinary acts. The boy here," he indicated Jacob, "can heal a wound as fast as St. Luke himself. The oblate, William, can perform feats of strength that would make Samson tremble. And this girl, this peasant girl, is taken by miraculous fits. She falls, she shakes, she cannot see nor hear, and yet she has visions of the future. True visions, your majesty. If I had to guess, I would hazard that she saw you in one of her fits. Is it true, Jeanne?" The refectory was totally silent as we waited for the little girl to speak. She seemed to be wrestling with something, for she stared at the king but said not a word. Pious Louis leaned across the table until his hair swung back and forth across his cheeks. "Did you see me in a vision, little girl?" Silence. And then, "Yes, your majesty, I saw you." "And what else did you see?" Jeanne became very still. She studied the grooves in the wooden table. "My little friend, please, tell me, what did you see?" I don't want to say." I barked with laughter. "You don't want to say? I'm sorry, little peasant, you don't exactly have a choice." But the king rebuked me. "Don't threaten her. Please, little girl. Your king is asking you to share your gift with him." I didn't mind the rebuke. It is an honor to be rebuked by the king, but I did not like him trusting her so soon and so far. But, as has happened many times before, the king proved himself wiser than me. His goodness is contagious, for he gave Jeanne a trust, and she felt it. And so Reluctantly at first, she gave her trust to him. "I had this vision long ago," she said. "It is the strangest, most confusing vision I have ever had." King Louis did not speak, but he nodded his head gently, encouragingly. "I saw Christ on the cross," Jeanne said. Instantly we crossed ourselves, thumbs inward, shoulder to shoulder, forehead to sternum. Everyone, that is, save Jacob, who saw it happen too late to try to imitate us. At the time, I noticed and wondered, just for an instant, if this boy was not of our faith. But the thought quickly escaped my mind as greater things presented themselves for my attention. "Christ was on the cross," Jeanne went on. "But it must have been by magic, because there were no nails in his hands or his feet, but they were still bleeding." She halted. "And?" the king asked. "Is there more? Was I there?" "You were at the foot of the cross. You were crying." "How crying? Crying aloud? Weeping?" "I am sorry, Your Majesty, you were kind of throwing a tantrum." The king sat straight up, stung. I laid a hand on his shoulder. "It is becoming to weep at the sight of our Lord's crucifixion," I assured him. "Yes," he replied, "but tantrums are less becoming in the presence of God, I would think." "Don't be too proud, my lord," I said. My beloved king turned to me and said, "You're telling me not to be proud?" His other companions laughed. I was pleased to be the butt of his joke. And then he asked, "Is there more, little girl?" "No. Well, there was a huge bird, an eagle or a vulture, I guess, flying overhead in circles around the cross. It was crying like it was hungry. Like I said, it was the strangest vision I ever—" Jeanne stopped speaking. The abbot had entered the refectory. His face was so dark I was certain he brought news of someone's death. He walked to the king's side and then gestured for Michelangelo to join him. They knelt together, the three of them, and the abbot began to whisper. A feeling of darkness and great foreboding entered my heart. I was right to worry, for just then a scream ripped through the stillness of the abbey. It was my beloved king. "By the scallop of St. James," he wailed, "by St. Hilda's hair, it cannot be!" The king launched himself onto the floor and began tearing at his clothes. The greyhound scrambled out from under the table. "It cannot be," the king was shrieking. "It cannot be. Why, Lord, oh why? I would rather the best city of my kingdom ruined, razed to the ground by the infidel." "My lord," I cried, beseeching him, "my lord, what's happened?" But he could not string two coherent words together. I thought first, of course, of his mother. He is closer to no one on earth. Surely she had suddenly died. The king writhed on the floor like he was being stung by a swarm of wasps. So I turned desperately now to Michelangelo de Bologna. The prior looked like he'd been struck in the face. "What is it?" I pleaded with him. "What's happened?" Michelangelo's voice was like the pealing of a funeral bell. "The holy nail at Saint Denis has been stolen." I nearly fell off the bench where I sat. William turned like he was a two-headed cat. "What do you mean? What's the holy nail?" "I don't know what that is." The commotion continued, crying and shouting and literal hand-wringing. William hissed at Jacob. "The holy nail! The holy nail!" "That's not helping me," Jacob informed him. "From the hand of Christ on the cross, the nail that held the Lord God in place during his crucifixion," William practically shouted. "Oh," Jacob said. "Oh, I guess that's pretty important," William replied. You think so? The king was moaning and squirming on the cold stones of the refectory. The holy nail, he whimpered. The holy nail. Which is when I fixed my gaze on Jean. It could not have been more than a murmur when I said it, but it silenced the whole refectory. There were no nails in his hands or his feet. My dear king was still weeping. We had collected him off the ground and made him sit on a bench. He sat with his shoulders slumped, his hands pressed between his knees, his tears streaming steadily down his pale, soft cheeks. If someone had told him to sit up like a big boy, it would not have felt out of place. The greyhound had stationed herself between the king's legs and was periodically reaching up and licking his face. He did not resist. While my beloved king was recovering from the shock of losing the most precious relic in France, I turned on the children and their guide, Michelangelo. As I see it, I said, standing before them, my legs set apart, my hands on my hips, there are just two possible explanations of what has just occurred. One is highly unlikely. The other is very disturbing. The first, that you are a group of modern saints. One of you just happens to have a vision predicting the disappearance of France's greatest treasure. Then you stumble upon the king just moments before he learns of the loss of the nail. It should be noted that this saint claims never to have seen the king before, and yet she recognizes him from her highly convenient vision. The second explanation, both more likely and more disturbing, this was all a plot. You stole the holy nail. You knew where the king would be, perhaps through friends of Michelangelo's here in the Abbey. You present yourselves as miracle workers, without the faintest evidence, I might add, in an attempt to gain the king's trust. I don't know what you did with the nail. Sell it? Or maybe you'll return it, having found the culprit and pinned your crime on some poor fool. Either way, you'll have ingratiated yourselves with the king, which, I imagine, would have been the prime purpose of the plot. After letting my accusation hang in the quiet air of the refectory for a moment, I added, if this second explanation is the case, I must note you are incredibly good actors, because right now you look completely flabbergasted. It was true. They did. All four of them stared at me with their brows knitted and their mouths hanging open. The king had, thankfully, stopped weeping by now. Occasionally a tear would slide down his royal nose and dangle from its curved tip, but at least the loud sobbing had ceased. He was paying attention to my trial. Interestingly, the dog was too. She came and sat between myself and the children, and her head moved back and forth between us, like a spectator at a university debate. After a moment of stunned silence, Michelangelo replied, "Do we even know the nail was stolen? The abbot here tells us it was lost while it was passed around for pilgrims to venerate. Might it not just have fallen from its jar?" "You keep the holy nail in a jar?" Jacob said. "Well, a vase, really. It's passed around in its vase for the pilgrims to kiss. The vase and the nail are kept in a great golden reliquary, adorned with gems and precious metals, and the great eagles of Charlemagne, who had the reliquary made." "Great eagles?" said William. "Yes," I said. "Charlemagne's coat of arms was an eagle." I stopped speaking, for I suddenly knew what William had meant. He was referring to Jean's vision. Louis understood too. He stood up and turned to the abbot. "Do you have horses?" "Of course, my liege." "Fast ones?" "Yes, of course." "Saddle them now." He turned to Michelangelo and the children. "You will not leave here till the nail is found." The greyhound barked at the king. He looked at the dog. "Nor you neither." Before I left the abbey with the king, I instructed one of the monks to listen behind a door at the side of the refectory, in case Michelangelo or the children revealed some treachery. This is what he witnessed. As soon as they were alone, William announced, "Either they find the nail, or they hang us from our thumbs until we tell them where we've hidden it." "Indeed," Michelangelo said, sighing. "Our mission may be over before it has begun." "Our lives may be over before they've begun," Jacob added, cradling his head in his hands. "Why did you tell the king about my visions?" Jean snapped at Michelangelo. "After he's done hanging us by our thumbs, he's likely to burn us as heretics and magicians." Michelangelo frowned and looked at the floor. "Well?" Jean demanded. Michelangelo shrugged. "I thought it would help." "It's more likely to get us killed." Michelangelo tugged at the fat under his chin. Then he said, "I do hope he finds the nail." Jacob groaned. Jean put her head on a table and covered it with her arms. Rain was falling outside the small, high windows, tiptoeing on the black branches and cold soil when we returned to the refectory. The earth smelled of thaw, and the smell, which is both hopeful and sad, seeped into the room, riding the wetness of the air. We entered like a funeral procession. First the abbot, then I, and the other companions, and finally the king. Or perhaps it was more like an execution. The king walked directly to Jean. He stood over the little girl. "Stand up!" I shouted. Jean stood. Jacob and William and Michelangelo did too. The dog began to whine. The king said, "We have searched the church." Jean closed her eyes. The rain was falling harder now, beating the roof of the refectory like drums of war, running down the sluices in torrents. And then the little girl was lifted into the air. She opened her eyes. She was suspended above the king, by the king. "We've found it," the king cried. "We've found it." Michelangelo bellowed, "God be praised." We started laughing, clapping the children on the back and rubbing their heads. William turned and threw his arms around Jacob, who was nearly crushed to death. And still the king carried Jean around the room, beaming up into her face, singing, "We found it! We found it!" Guinevere danced at the king's feet. Jean managed to say, "Where?" The king stopped dancing. He kept Jean suspended above his head. He looked into her eyes. It had fallen into the mouth of one of the eagles, all the way down its throat and into its hollow belly. A hungry eagle indeed. He laughed and started dancing again. "We've found it! We've found it!" I watched Jean hoisted up and down in the air by the king. She glanced at the other children. Their lips were lined with sweat, their faces drawn, but they were smiling at her.